We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order.
So when we typically think of crystal balls, we think of pop culture. We think of these crystal balls filling with smoke or showing us really clear, pristine images. And when we use crystal balls for divinational work in real world, they don't really work that way.
Coming up this week, a special edition entitled Crystal Balls and the Death of the Washington World Order. Two relatively short-term scenarios with very long-term implications, presented in audio essay form by our two hosts. In part one, Philip Pilkington outlines his take on what could happen after the US election. An extended sketch on the possibility of violent Trussification. He thinks that the bond market bullying of the incoming Trump administration could in turn set off a chain of events that demand a new wave of de-dollarisation. In part two, Andrew Collingwood flips the perspective from west to east, and from currency wars to trade wars. He'll be looking at the world from China's point of view, in the light of this week's US trade tariffs on Chinese goods, including a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. The Chinese have studied how nations rise, and they've come up with a plan to leapfrog the US in the technological pecking order. As the low-tariff, liberal Washington order slips away, what becomes of a world where China is no longer content with low and medium-value manufacturing, but is instead actively targeting the crowning heights that America has long claimed as its unique domain? But first to the crystal ball, it's Philip Pilkington.
So we wouldn't usually want to make election predictions on Multipolarity because, making predictions often about specific events like that is a bit of a fool's errand. But I think there's a case to be made to make some broad provisional predictions in that direction, because the election in the US, as we'll talk about further detail soon, could set off, could trigger a wave of events that could change the world very rapidly, very quickly. And I think this is worth considering. All this, of course, is speculative, but I think it's reasonable speculation. So in terms of the election itself, I don't think it's any secret that it does look like Trump will probably win. The Democrats have tried pretty much everything. People probably follow it on the news. I saw last week the top article in the Financial Times was Stormy Daniels divulging intimate details about an encounter with the former president somewhere or other. So that's the sort of lurid stuff that's bouncing around the C-suite at the moment, apparently. Financial Times readers, sophisticated bunch. But beyond that, it really doesn't look like any of the political ops that have been thrown up to try and prevent Trump from running ultimately are going to work. And that's not actually a surprise, because in America, it's very difficult to stop someone from running for president. Famously, I think it's bounced around a bit that Trump could technically run from a jail cell. Might get him even more support at this stage too. So in terms of the polling, well, there's something interesting about the polling. So the polls historically for the 2016 cycle and the 2020 cycle have had what pollsters call a shy Trump voter effect. The shy voter first came to be known, I think, in the 1990s in Britain, shy conservative voters. These would be people with kind of liberal principle attitudes, read the right newspaper and so on, but they held their nose and voted Tory because they wanted low taxes. Obviously, the shy Trump voter has very different motivations. It's probably kind of a professional or a white-collar worker whose colleagues really don't like Trump. Might be a husband whose wife really doesn't like Trump. There's a lot of rumors of that going around. But for whatever reason, there's a shy Trump voter effect in the polls, and that's why the polls I just saw here, I pulled up just before the show, the famous 538 prediction of the 2016 election. People have probably forgotten about this. I'd forgotten about it, which showed Hillary Clinton's chance of winning at 71.4%, Donald Trump's at 28.6%, and a map of just deep kind of blue. obviously, this did not come to pass. Nate Silver is the best known pollster in America, and his track record is pretty shaky, it must be said. But look, this was an outcome of the shy Trump effect. You can quantify that effect a little bit more. In 2016, Trump was polling at about 43.5% of the vote, went on to get 46.1%. And in 2020, he was polling at 43% of the vote, and he went on to get nearly 47%. So there's a big shy Trump effect there. So anyway, what does all this tie in? Well, the fact is, if anyone's looked at polls recently, Trump is actually ahead. The other polls in 2016 and 2020 never showed Trump ahead. The aggregate general election polling never showed him ahead. And polls at the moment, some of them are showing him 13 points ahead, 6 points ahead, 9 points ahead, like decent lead. Maybe the average is a little lower than that, but I mean this is a decent lead. And of course, on the other hand, Joe Biden's disapproval ratings are, I think, they're record actually, at least since Carter, I think. Disapproval, it's 55.6% of Americans as of the time of recording disapprove of Joe Biden, 38.1% approve. And I think we understand quite a bit as to why this is. We haven't actually done a segment on the show about it yet. We may, although it's a little old news. But back a few weeks ago, in late March, Larry Summers, former Secretary of the Treasury Larry Summers, and Democrat and deep Democrat player Larry Summers, published a paper with some other economists showing that if inflation was measured as it historically had been in previous inflations in the 1970s, for example, inflation reached about 18% in 2022. And what Summers is getting at here is the economic pain that Americans are feeling is much, much worse than what we'd assume if we just look at headline CPI figures or headline unemployment figures or headline GDP growth figures or anything like that. And this is exactly what's showing up in consumer sentiment polls. That's what the paper is based on. He's showing this divergence between what's called the misery index, inflation and unemployment, and the consumer sentiment polls. Usually these things track each other. They've stopped tracking each other. And Summers and his co-authors very cleverly show that the divergence can all be explained if you adjust for a new measurement of inflation, where they strip out basically mortgage interest rate payments and I think car loan payments as well. If you add them back in, which you should if you're trying to determine the amount of pain people are in, once you add them back in, you see that the misery index tracks the consumer sentiment index. So this pretty much provides us with an explanation of why Biden is doing so poorly in the polls. The polls themselves are showing that Trump's going to win, where they never have before. We know there's a shy Trump voter effect in those polls. So I think when you take all that evidence together, you both have the polling, which seems to point in this direction, and then you kind of have this kind of hard evidence that we're actually misunderstanding how bad the economy is. Of course, that's showing up in the polling as well. Economy, Joe Biden consistently polls poorly on the economy. And although it's anecdotal, if you go and you watch kind of like focus group type things on YouTube with people talking about the election, they all talk about prices and the economy. It's constant. It's a constant theme. And they say, oh, things were so much better under Trump, even if I didn't like him and all this kind of thing. So that's the feeling. So I think with all those pieces of evidence, we can say that unless something really profound happens between now and November, and it might, but unless something really profound happens, it seems highly likely that Trump is going to win. I won't put a percentage chance on it, but if I were going to put a percentage chance, I'd say about 80%. I think it's very, very likely that Trump's going to win. So next January, I think we're going to see a second Trump term.
So when working with your crystal ball, there are two main things that you want to focus on: size and opaqueness.
So the interesting things that might start to happen randomly after Trump is elected are twofold. One of them is political and institutional, and the other one is economic. One of these is more speculative than the other, but I think both of them are pretty realistic. The institutional one first. So a lot of people don't really understand what happened when Trump was elected in 2016. No one really expected that he was going to be elected. That's the first thing. The second thing is that Trump's campaign is probably one of the most organic political phenomenons that's ever taken place in Western politics. It just came from nowhere. It was obviously, it's been endlessly discussed, and I'm sure most listeners know this, but it really did just come out of nowhere. It was led by one guy, and there wasn't kind of an institutional framework around Trumpism. It didn't have time for people to glom onto it and to form it. And usually when you have a political party coming up, and it kind of, even when it surprises, like say Sinn Féin in Ireland over the past 15 years, as it comes up, it builds slow momentum and people start to glom onto it, and it starts to attract ideas and a little bit of an infrastructure. And people who previously opposed the idea eventually kind of get on board because they see political opportunities for themselves. And a lot of the time, this means a kind of recycling of the political elite in a sense. Like, they will change their minds, but it'll always kind of be similar people bopping around. And those people tend to know how to get things done in some shape or form, even if only politically, even if they're completely incompetent in terms of their policy and so on. They know how to get things done politically, appointments, that kind of thing, management of people, personnel, all that kind of thing. The day-to-day that the public don't really see. And basically, when Trump was elected in 2016, that infrastructure did not exist. And so what happened was a staffing crisis, which I know quite a bit about. This staffing crisis, basically, they did not know how to fill positions in the Trump administration at all. And people probably vaguely remember this. There was some really weird things that happened in the Trump administration. There was a celebrity, I recall, and then she broke out into a big scandal where she talked about all her former colleagues. I can't remember her name. She was one of Trump's Mar-a-Lago friends. Then there was Scaramucci, who was press secretary, the Mooch, as they call him. He was press secretary for like 2 weeks or something. There was all this crazy churn. But behind the scenes, what was really happening was there was kind of three basic ideal types of Trump administration appointees. The first were kind of grifters, in a sense, kind of messers who like glommed onto Trump in his Mar-a-Lago days and, liked to flattered the president and so on. Maybe he was a friend from the old celebrity days or something like that. And those people were kind of just given roles, and they tended to be an absolute disaster and obviously completely ineffective because they had no relevant experience for the roles. Then there was the kind of dissident outsider, but I don't want to use the outsider term too strongly because these tended to be people who had some experience in DC or around politics or policymaking, but they'd always kind of been dissidents in that role. They probably had quite good jobs in the past, and their CV was perfectly plushed out to work in DC, but they always kind of found themselves grinding up against the machine. Those were the tiny minority in the 2016 coalition, and a lot of those people got washed out pretty quickly because the rest of the apparatus was so dysfunctional and it wouldn't turn in the direction that they wanted it to turn in. And then that brings us to the third type that was in. It was DC Insider, in effect. And these people kind of staffed all the key positions. And in a sense, a lot of people complained about them because they said this is a swamp crawling back in and so on. Maybe there's some truth to that. But ultimately, they kept the ship on course. These people knew how to operate the levers in DC, and they kept DC going. And in fairness to a lot of these people, because I know one or two of them, they actually took some large professional and personal credibility hits from working for the Trump administration, and they kind of did it out of, in a sense, patriotic duty to keep the whole thing moving. So I'm not as unfriendly to this group as some people are. So the net effect of this was basically that the ship just kept moving. The ship just kept moving, driven mainly by Group 3, by the kind of old school insiders who just kept things rolling along. And then you had kind of blow-ups with the kind of grifter bunch, and then you had this mass disillusion on the part of the idealistic reformer types. Well, everything's changed. This is not a secret. You can read articles about it in the high-end political press in America. The next Trump administration, there are plans to staff it properly. And I think they have a pretty good idea of how to staff it properly. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, it means that Group 2, the previously disillusioned reformers, are going to get a lot of key roles in the Trump administration, is my feeling. And what will happen then, inevitably, is that when they get the ship to try and turn in a different direction, they'll meet resistance from the ingrained interests in DC or the ingrained people, administrators, that kind of thing. And ultimately, that's going to result in conflict. And I'll remind listeners, if they don't know, the American president is basically an elected monarchy. The president has the capacity to fire almost anyone, from the lowliest FBI junior officer right up to the top bureaucrat that you've never heard of but actually runs everything. He can fire any of them. Very unlike the British civil service in that regard. So this is going to create a conflict. And to my mind, this conflict is almost inevitable. And it will create chaos in DC on a scale I think that we've never seen before. I don't know what exactly that's going to look like, but it's going to be a very, very chaotic process. So my assumption is, starting in January next year, if and when Trump gets elected, we're going to see this gradual buildup of tension and conflict in DC. Not just these silly scandals that we saw in the 2016 one, like genuine kind of turf wars between reformers, or whatever you want to call them. Maybe you call them troublemakers, whatever, it doesn't really matter. And the long-standing bureaucracy in DC, and well-connected political people and people who make things spin in a certain direction. And I think that this could get very, very messy. So the second thing, and remember, these are going to be layered on top of each other probably. The second thing, there have been murmurings now for a while. I think we've actually discussed it briefly on the podcast before. But there's been murmurings around DC now for a while that America could face a kind of a Liz Truss moment. If anyone remembers the mini budget in the UK, where the Truss government was basically destroyed in a matter of weeks by an attack of the bond markets, effectively, due to the Truss government wanting to cut some taxes. Pretty modest stuff, actually, but it triggered this enormous reaction, and this took down the government because there was effectively a run on British bonds. Well, there's a lot of chatter that could happen in America. There's lots of people around DC that are saying this, and it's increasing in volume. So I'll just give an example. Market Watch today, time of recording, has an article titled "A Recession Could Trigger a U.S. Debt Crisis," Wall Street economists warn. I'll just read some of this because it's very much so what you hear behind the scenes as well. So this is from Apollo's Torsten Slok. He's an economist. He's a very good economist, actually. And he's pointing out that the purchasers of U.S. treasuries have changed from being governments. It used to be foreign governments that purchased a lot of them. These are the foreign buyers, by the way, to pension and insurance companies. And they're accepting this new issuance due to high interest rates. And of course, in the event of a recession unwinding, interest rates will come back down, and these people might actually dump them. Just to quote Slok himself, he says, "We're shifting from a yield insensitive buyer," that's a government, so they don't really care, they just want the asset no matter what it looks like, to a yield sensitive buyer. And that's just one component. We could almost do a whole show on the changes that are taking place in the market for foreign debt, for foreign US government bonds. The main takeaway from it is China aren't buying as many, and we might talk about that a little bit more in what follows. But some of the talk and the way that it's being portrayed as a Liz Truss moment and so on makes me a little bit paranoid that there might be a little bit of a plan hatching here. I'm sure listeners know how dirty politics America is these days. People almost will seem to do anything to get one over on the other guy, and they don't really care about the collateral damage it causes. Well, I'm sure the Democrats paid close attention to the fact that a pretty unpopular government, unpopular among the, shall we say, liberal elite, was tossed out of office very handily and very quickly by what Truss says was a manufactured crisis. Was it? I'll leave it to others to speculate. Certainly, the Treasurer and the Bank of England did not come to save Liz Truss when the bond market went nuts. I'd say Democrats paid attention to that and began to think to themselves, well, in their mind, having another Trump presidency is literally the worst thing in the world. There's nothing worse than that. Well, could a similar crisis hit Trump? And the way that you basically do this is you just spread the message like what's happening now. And when Trump gets in, he'll be boxed in like Liz Truss was. He can either fire ahead and try and pursue a plan, some sort of a strategy, a Trump governance strategy, which will cost money because everything always costs money, or he'll be an austerity president. And if you're an austerity president, you can't get anything done, and your approval ratings just go to the wall. Look what happened to Rishi Sunak, right? So he'll be boxed in. He'll either go and do something that might be disruptive and then face the consequences of that, or he'll be completely boxed in with his hands tied on all economic issues, only able to kind of sound off about maybe some cultural stuff. Well, we all know Trump the man, right? Of course he'll go with the disruptive option. And so that's where this whole edifice can start to get very, very messy very, very quickly. Remember, this would be a trust-style crisis, some sort of a financial crisis, a debt crisis, all these things that people are talking about in the financial press at the moment and chattering about behind the scenes, layered on top of a governance crisis caused by this attempt to restructure the way that power is exercised in Washington, D.C. And I think with those two things flowing together, you could be going into a vastly accelerated moment of change. And what that change will mean, short version, is a massively accelerated process of moving toward the multipolar world. When I talked about Torsten Slock's prognostications on the US bond market, the Chinese are kind of pulling out of providing the foreign demand for US government debt. It used to be that the Chinese government would just buy up tons of this stuff. Now, it's actually been a fairly long process that they've been moving away from this, and there's a variety of different reasons why they're moving away from this. But it's really been since the 2008 financial crisis, and the TLDR version of it is they got really badly burned on US assets in 2008 when the markets crashed out. And I think they thought to themselves, like, we're sending goods over to America for nothing except assets, paper assets. And that's kind of okay if those assets are like stable or they grow over time or they're not that volatile. And then they got hit with that big whack in 2008. And I think they said, I don't think those assets are really worth that much. But they're definitely not worth the price printed on them. So it's been kind of a gradual move out of that kind of role as the kind of lender of last resort to the United States, propping up their current account deficit, their trade deficit, and maintaining the value of the dollar. Now, China can't completely do that because obviously China relies on the US as an export market. Now, that is diminishing too, as we've pointed out many times in the show. China have, in the past 4 or 5 years, massively moved away from relying on the US as their trade partner, and they've started trading with all these other nations, BRICS countries, ASEAN countries, all these. So all of this has been massively accelerated as well by the seizure of the Russian foreign exchange reserves, which we've talked about on the show many, many times, which is really the big trigger, the immediate catalyst trigger of de-dollarisation. 2008 set the scene for it. It made people a little bit less trustful of dollar assets and so on. But they still kind of just, they went along anyway. The seizure of the Russian assets was like, okay, this stuff may not just be volatile and not worth the price printed on it. They may also take it from you if they don't like you doing something in the world. And I think at that point you really go, okay, I don't want this stuff anymore. So some figures from Reuters. China currently holds $782 billion of treasury. And that's a lot. That's US government treasuries. And that's a lot. But it's the smallest in 15 years. And it's down significantly from the peak of 1.3 trillion in 2013. So 1.3 trillion to 782 billion, that's almost half. So as Torsten Slock points out, the people picking up the bag here that the Chinese have dropped are pension and insurance funds, foreign pension and insurance funds, non-US pension and insurance firms. And as he says, these are much more investment sensitive. He says yield sensitive, but you might think of it as investment sensitive, i.e. they are judging the asset as an asset. They're not like the Chinese, like, I'll just buy the bond, it doesn't matter. It's all part of our trade strategy. Pension funds and insurance companies don't have external trade, global trade strategies. That's not what they do. They care about having a certain amount of income to pay for their pensions and to pay for insurance claims. And so they will only buy the debt if it fits with certain investment criteria. And of course, what Slock is saying is right now, that's maintaining a high coupon, a high interest rate, and so on. So this is how this would start to unfold, basically, that China already aren't really standing behind the US bond market anymore. And when I say standing behind the US bond market, you can ultimately shorthand say standing behind the US dollar, plugging the current account deficit and thereby keeping the dollar at a relatively high level and allowing America to live beyond their means. China are no longer backstopping that in the same way that they did before. And now America is relying on the kindness of investors, and those investors are judging the financial products as financial products. And of course, the problem is that their judgment might change. Now, what would change that? Slock says a recession. Certainly, a recession could change that. We can get back to that in a moment if we want. But what could also change it is just a big panic because of a Trump policy, or because all of the financial press just stampedes Trump because he puts forward a policy that the America, quote unquote, can't afford. That's exactly what happened to Liz Truss. I can totally imagine that happening next year. And I can totally imagine it being at least partly politicized. I don't think that the people who would get behind this would fully even understand what they're doing. They're political people. So they just go, oh, well, the government's broke, which it kind of is in America. Biden's completely overspent. We've talked about this a million times before. He's leaving a big black hole in the budget for Trump. And everybody understands this at a basic kind of instinctual level. So when Trump gets in and he tries to do some sort of a spending policy or something, or tax cut or something, that the media just turns on him like Trump, like what happened with Truss. And all the political people that don't like Trump, which is a lot of people, just kind of pile on this. And of course, these people don't really understand how profound the consequences of what they're doing is, because being political people, they're just completely transfixed by the shiny object in front of them at any given moment in time. That shiny object is, of course, future President Donald Trump, past and future President Donald Trump. So that's how I'd see this playing out. And by the way, it does raise an interesting prospect. Now, we're going really deep down the speculative rabbit hole here. But one potential way that Trump could mitigate that is do a deal with the Chinese to start backstopping the debt again. Now, that's a whole different story, and we won't go down that part of the rabbit hole. But it's a possibility, and I've heard that being talked about by Trump, but also about Yellen. That's a kind of a thing, something that's bouncing around DC a little bit. But that is the basic outline of how this would work. And you can probably start to see the moving parts at this stage. Again, remember, this will be taking part against a backdrop of probably some sort of staffing crisis in DC. And that includes at the US Treasury and probably even at the Federal Reserve, because there's rumors going around in the press that Trump might actually fire Jerome Powell and put in a political appointee. So at every level, there could be chaos. So listeners of Multipolarity can probably, at this stage, start to put the pieces together. What we're talking about is a sort of a nuclear option for multipolarity, in a sense. I mean, it would be a self-nuke, right? It would be internal political turmoil in the US, bringing the country down quite a dangerous economic route. What that would mean for the broader world is a massive acceleration of the process of multipolarity. Because if this started to unwind, the dollar system would unwind forcefully and very, very quickly. And so people would have to scramble to put together some sort of a new system. Now, you'll probably get a compromise system out of that. You won't get the final product, would be my guess. But people will be scrambling. The dollar, which is a relative certainty, even to this day, obviously we talk about de-dollarisation a lot, but that, at the moment it's a very slow process whereby people kind of nudge out of the dollar here, nudge out of the dollar there. But ultimately, if you want to do some trade right now, as we speak, you can pick up some dollars and do that trade. It still works. The system still works. People aren't as keen on the system anymore, and it's fraying at the edges, and people are experimenting with other stuff, but the system works. What I'm describing here is a situation in which the system stops working. That the dollars you're holding to do the trade, that's your backup, that's your go-to, stops working in some sense. The dollar's value becomes unstable. The debt markets have seized up, et cetera, et cetera. And in that circumstance, people will be forced to experiment. So we might think of this as almost what happened to Russia after the start of the war. The war and the sanctions pushed Russia to immediately change everything. And we saw how quickly they did. Everything from the cars being manufactured there to the way they did business with other countries, everything changed. And if something like what I'm describing occurs, that's precisely what we'll see. We'll see a mass scramble, and all of these little slow-moving events that we're seeing right now that are creating the process of de-dollarisation will just turbocharge. And like in a year, we'll look back and we'll be in a different world.
When you are actively working with your crystal ball, it's training yourself to go in and out of this meditative state at will. Overall, learning how to use a crystal ball is definitely an intermediate form of divination. It takes practice and cannot be learned overnight.
Well, after we heard Philip talking about the potential decline, quite serious decline of the US economy, there was another big story this week which suggested a great deal of weakness in the US economy. And that was the decision of the White House to put tariffs on electric vehicles, most prominently, or expand tariffs on electric vehicles, I should say, but also a range of other sectors that the Chinese are enjoying a great deal of success in their export market at the moment. I'm sure that our always intelligent and alert listeners will have seen this story and read some of the opinion and some of the analysis of what this actually means. But let's get right to it. The story, I think, has missed a very basic thing, or a very basic thing has been skirted over, and that is that the tariffs that have been imposed or expanded, increased, are far more wide-ranging in terms of the sectors that they touch than is implied. Steel and aluminium tariffs will increase from 0% to 7.5%, right up to 25% now. Semiconductors will go from 25% to 50%. Batteries and products and materials associated with batteries will go from 7.5% to 25%. Solar cells will go from 25% to 50%. Medical products will go from 0% to 25%. And most prominently, electric vehicle tariffs are being whacked up from 25% already right up to 100%. So if you buy a Chinese electric vehicle in the US this year, it will be twice the cost of that electric vehicle, essentially. It's a 100% tariff, which is it's strange because a tweet circulated that I retweeted from one Joseph P. Biden, president-elect from the 11th of June 2019, which said, I quote, "Trump doesn't get the basics. He thinks his tariffs are being paid by China. Any freshman econ student could tell you that American people are paying his tariffs." What's caused the change of heart? Well, I think it's fair to say that America feels that China's eating its lunch. America feels that on a whole range of products that it views as its own, quite kind of cutting edge, high tech, high value added manufactured products. China has just stole the march, and the US can't compete within the current economic system. And therefore it's going to pull up a trade wall. Whether that will work, whether we've discussed on the podcast many times previously that we think it'll be very difficult to work. We've seen how badly these things have worked in Russia, and no doubt they'll work equally badly in China. These things will just get routed through Mexico or Vietnam or any number of other countries that there aren't tariffs on, and the Chinese will send the products and they'll kind of be bolted together in Mexico and then sent across the Rio Grande. But anyway, it's a very serious escalation of the trade war. That's the main story. But I think that we are missing a much bigger story of what this means and the signal that this is sending. Well, the bigger story is that this isn't just about tariffs. The first thing is that even during the Cold War for the Western world, but certainly since the end of the Cold War in 1991 and the kind of the opening of the communist world, the US has really eulogized and proselytized and even strong-armed and put serious pressure on countries to open up their economies, to embrace free trade as the way to get economic growth and prosperity for everybody. That's been really one of the key pillars of US foreign policy and diplomacy. It's been this idea that if the world can open up, if the world can embrace free trade, we'll all get richer. And it's really pushed this very hard. And as I say, it's used a great deal of diplomatic capital to achieve some of this. And it's also even, gone so far as to strong arm a lot of countries into accepting this. Key to that, of course, was the 1995 creation of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to replace its predecessor, GATT. And the WTO had a much more comprehensive set of rules and, crucially, some teeth to kind of bite into those who broke the rules. But as many of our listeners will be aware, the US has not been treating the WTO very kindly recently. The WTO found against the US in a case that China brought against it. And Washington essentially used its ability to gum up the works of the WTO so that it couldn't do anything to punish the US. But these tariffs, in addition to some of the sanctions on higher tech goods, are the US, essentially, we should not ignore what the US is doing here. It's a much bigger thing than is being accepted or recognized, I should say, in the mainstream media and even in some of the financial papers. They're essentially saying that era is over. We're not doing that anymore. Or it might be good for you, but certainly we're not doing it anymore. What they're essentially saying is, that's it. It's over. Like, we're not going to listen to WTO rulings. We're not going to play by those rules. We're not going to have free trade anymore. Look at that list of products. It's by no means comprehensive. But steel, aluminium, semiconductors, batteries and associated products, solar cells, medical products, electric vehicles. I think even shipbuilding cranes were included. I didn't include that on my list previously, but even they were included. So it's by no means a comprehensive list, but it's big enough. And you combine it with some of the trade restrictions it's put on China in other areas, such as Chinese access to the highest end microchips, and it's the US saying that's it, we're done. And I think we should recognize this, that old system of free trade and free movement of goods across borders, and the trend towards ever smaller trade barriers and even non-trade barriers is done. It's finished. It's over. Because the country that used all its serious, significant muscle, and let's not forget, the US in the 1990s and early 2000s had a lot of heft behind it. So the country that drove this is essentially saying, no, we're finished with this. It's done. But I also think there's a kind of even bigger story there in terms of geostrategy. And that story is this. The US or Washington is, whether it intends to or not, it is sending a message to China to say, no, we are not going to allow you to develop economically as you would have in a natural way within the current trading system, within the current global economic system. Like, we were quite happy when you were making kind of, cheap stuff for dollar stores and, when we could outsource some of our kind of labor to you and, okay, it would make some American workers unemployed, but we'd make a fortune for our shareholders and our executives. We were kind of happy with that. But when it comes to electric vehicles, solar cells, semiconductors, the medical products, the things that we expect to be cornerstones of the 21st century economy, the things that we kind of see as ours. We were the first country to take up the second industrial revolution with steel and standardization and motor cars and telecommunications, electrification. We were then the first country to do all of the digitization and computer technology and internet technology, all of that sort of stuff. And, we want to be the first country to do all of this new set of stuff. And we're not going to let anybody else do it. And we will tip over the table and change the rules if we have to. That's the message that they're sending China. Like, no, we're not going to let you do this. And I think that's undeniable if you look at this list of tariffs. And if you look at, as I said earlier, some of the other restrictions that the United States has put on China. And I think that probably has grave implications for the future of the multipolar world. It's basically, the Chinese ought to know by now that I'm not saying that the Chinese necessarily wanted this. I'm not saying that the Chinese were all sweetness and light and hoped to hold hands with Washington as they strode together to a bright new age. I'm not necessarily saying that, but what I'm saying is the Chinese should know now, in no uncertain terms, that the US is not going to allow both countries to compete and cooperate and have an arrangement of kind of mutually beneficial economic development and growth. China should now understand that the US see this as something of a zero-sum game, where either the US Washington wins or Beijing wins. China should understand that. And I don't think China are going to necessarily retaliate hard to these sanctions because they want access to the American market. They don't want to start a trade war. China's economy is reliant on, exogenous demand, i.e., they rely on export markets. They're producing more than they consume at the moment. So they don't want to enter a trade war. They still want access to the American market, but they can now safely make plans and set a strategy designed for a world in which zero-sum great power competition is taking place along the economic axis of that competition. And they can discard any notions of mutually beneficial growth, development, cooperation, and competition. What's really interesting about this is what's happening on the China side. Like, what is their plan? What is their strategy for moving forward in the 21st century economically? And what does that involve? And it's far bigger than people imagine. People imagine that they want to engage in some kind of mercantilist effort to flood markets with Chinese products or to take over certain market sectors and gain benefits from that. People, imagine that they want to basically outcompete the Americans on cars and all of the other things that America's been famous for. I read an article very recently about something that happened in March, and I suddenly realized that the Chinese plan is far greater than that. It's not even the same sport, let alone the same playing field as that kind of image of what we imagine China hopes to achieve and do. So, I mean, let's start from the beginning. China's growth has slowed since the onset of COVID. People will remember they had a zero COVID policy where they had their economy shut down for far longer than the West, much like longer measured in years. And since then, it hasn't recovered to the same growth rate that it had previously. And there are many theories and ideas about why this might be. Some people think that it's purges within the Communist Party and business community have essentially paralyzed the bureaucracy. They don't know what to do, what's acceptable anymore. Will they get caught up in these purges? Other people think that basically like COVID badly wounded, or the zero COVID policy badly wounded China's capitalistic animal spirits that were kind of running free before that. Other economists think that a big problem is the property bubble, in that really that's a boil that needs lancing so that they can cut out the poison and let the skin heal back over. But it's too big to do that. If they did that, the whole economy would pop. And because of that, you've got this kind of shambling debt crisis, which is weighing everything down. But I think, I think the most general view from most mainstream economists, led by Michael Pettis, who Philip Pilkington talks about regularly, believes that essentially China's policies economic policies are far too much in favor, or they're slanted far too much to benefit state investment in a country where savings are much too high and consumption is much too low. And what needs to happen is the Chinese economy needs to have a painful rebalancing between savings and investment on one side and consumption on the other, so that those two are much more balanced. And they're not doing that. And that's why they're failing to get as much bang for their buck as they used to. And in March, there was the annual meeting of the National People's Congress of the Communist Party of China. And a lot of investors in China, both from China and internationally, were expecting to hear at that Congress what the plan was. Are they going to do something with a property bubble? Are they going to do something that lets kind of capitalism back, reinvigorates capitalism again? Are they going to do something to, end the purges and give people confidence again? Are they going to kind of try to encourage consumption somehow to what are they going to do? What's the plan? And they left this meeting like dumbfounded, because they did have a plan, but it was far more vast in scope and ambitious than anything that they had anticipated, and didn't really address any of those issues. So Tanner Greer, who is a researcher, a consultant, and an author of the Scholars Stage blog, which I highly recommend to all of our listeners. It's one of the best resources on geostrategy in China. It's called Scholars Stage. So Tanner Greer, he wrote a fantastic piece for Foreign Policy magazine about what happened, what was said at this Congress. And basically, Greer argues that the Chinese have been very closely studying Western scholarship on the rise and fall of great powers. And they've been attempting to kind of discern hard rules that kind of dictate how and why great powers gain strength and eventually reach hegemonic status, like Britain did and then America did, and then why they collapse down back to become also-rans. I mean, many of us, I've read a book, indeed, by a wonderful book by Paul Kennedy called The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, but scholarship on this goes right back to Adam Smith. If you remember Adam Smith, he said that nations can be lifted from essentially barbarism to a great degree of prosperity just by having peace, protect rule of law, and especially property law, and sound hands-off government, right? So there are all kinds of theories about what causes the rise and fall of great powers, but the Chinese have done their own reading of this scholarship. And according to Tanner Greer, the kind of like the Xi Jinping himself and his kind of like the inner thinkers of the Politburo believe that they've hit on three rules, or they've hit on three ideas that they believe are going to dictate the 21st century economy, 21st century strength of nations, the rise of great powers, economic development, and the rest. And these three rules are this. The first rule that they've come up with is that technology and science are the most important element of national strength and economic growth. Okay, so rule of law, no. Capitalism, no. Financial intermediary services, no. It's technology and science, they argue. The second rule is that advances in technology and science don't happen on a kind of a gradual or like a smooth line or curve where it moves up like at a 45-degree angle or kind of curves up in a kind of an exponential kind of curve. No, they say what happens is technological and scientific advances take place in kind of sudden jumps where you get like a great leap forward and then a period where the gains from that leap are kind of integrated into lives and economies and society. And the majority of the benefits from those jumps accrue to the country that has figured out what these new developments are and integrates them to their economy first. So the examples they give, you had the first industrial revolution in the late 18th and early 19th century, and Britain was the first mover there, or even the mid 18th century, and Britain was the first mover there. It was the one who actually made a lot of these developments, and it was the one who was able to integrate them into the economy the fastest. And by doing that, Britain became the preeminent power in the world by the middle of the mid and late 19th century. Then you had the second industrial revolution, which was all about railroads and the telegram and electrification and steel and the standardization of machine tools and all of that kind of thing. That was America that did that, and that happened in the between the middle and the late 19th century, and by the early to mid 20th century, America was the preeminent internet global power. And then you also had something that's more debatable, I suppose, in terms of the effect it had, but it was the digitalization revolution, the kind of, in inverted commas, third industrial revolution that was based on satellites, mobile telecommunications, computers, the internet, and all of that kind of stuff. And again, America was the leader in that. And of course, that's why America controls a lot of stuff like cloud computing, software, social media, internet giants, telephone companies, Apple, Google, Android, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's what the Chinese think. They get these the second rule is you get these sudden leaps in scientific advancement, and the benefits of those leaps go to those countries which make the advances themselves and then integrate them into their economies. The third thing they've discerned, or they believe, is that the next leap is happening now. It's in a nascent stage now. And that leap involves a kind of a confluence of sectors that include AI and machine learning, which is the big one we all hear about. It includes new telecommunications and cryptography. It includes quantum computing, green energy, aerospace engineering, material science, neuroscience, and medical science as well. And this kind of confluence of sectors which are starting to show signs of making the next leap forward will constitute essentially the fourth industrial revolution. And the Chinese the Chinese believe that's happening now. And what their plan is to do, essentially, it's not to deal with the property bubble. It's not to kind of think about, whether we should tweak the economy a little bit to let loose capitalist, animalistic instincts. It's not to think about how to fine-tune the economy in terms of the balance between consumption and investment and savings. It's to essentially lead that next technological leap, that fourth industrial leap, and to integrate those new developments into their economy faster than anybody else. China wants to be the center, the global leader, the driving force of scientific and technological development. And it hopes by achieving that, it will achieve a great leap in economic development, economic growth, standards of living, and essentially the power and strength of its nation. And this is a far bigger and more ambitious scope than anything really that's going on in the West. And I think this is one of the big stories that's being missed at the moment. So to return to kind of terra firma beyond all of these lofty ambitions that the Communist Party of China has, this vision that they have about the future of China and the world, to make these ideas concrete, what do they mean for the at present inchoate and nascent multipolar world order? What do they mean for relations between China and the world? What do they mean for what Philip was talking about and the kind of the decline of America, essentially, and the kind of political dysfunction and financial and economic difficulty it appears to be heading toward? Well, I can't give listeners a firm answer to that because this is a bet. It's a gamble that the Chinese are making. It's a big gamble. As Tanner Greer points out, the Chinese mention that the British took advantage of the first industrial revolution, the Americans of the second, and then the third, but it doesn't mention all of those nations and all of those economic blocs that have attempted to make such a quantum leap and have failed. And it's cost them dearly because of all of the effort that, all of the capital that they've sunk into it and all of the time that they've put into it and the failure. I think it also depends on how America responds. I'm a little bit less pessimistic than Philip Pilkington about America. I think I don't know much about America, but I get the impression that it is a country prone more than some of the old world European countries to wild swings of kind of national emotion. It's gone through these before. It had a civil war. It was pretty close to a second civil war as well in the early part of the 20th century. It had a horrific depression, and it emerged from these, extremely strong. It still has tremendous power. Might it be that, this fourth industrial revolution is happening, but the US system of kind of benign neglect and letting capitalism rip, but also pumping state money into research and development at what are still quite elite universities and, having a large population and, reasonably highly educated, being a magnet for super highly educated immigrants, is that system, and also let's not forget the financial clout and financing skill and ability of Wall Street, but now also on the West Coast, the Silicon Valley venture capitalists. Like, could that system be more suited to drive some of these technological innovations and then integrate them into an economy in an efficient way? Possibly. I'm starting to have my doubts because what's clear is the Chinese have an obvious plan for this. Moving back to the tariffs that we spoke about right at the top of this segment, the Americans seem to have shoveled a whole bunch of money toward, without really a plan. Okay, we'll get the Taiwanese company to come across and build a chip factory. Okay, we'll shovel a whole bunch of money toward the semiconductor sector. Okay, we'll shovel even more money toward, the green sector. But is there actually a plan to make that work? Or is it just the kind of industrial equivalent of sending everybody checks to stay home during COVID? Because that's sure how it seems at the moment. And then you combine that with these tariffs that's saying we're not competing. We're further back than we hoped we would be. Because we're not selling as many of our goods into China as they're able to sell to us and to sell elsewhere in the world. Is the US in this sense essentially saying, well, we and perhaps Europe, but maybe not, as we've spoken many times before, there's that great battle in Europe between the Atlanticists and the autonomists. But ideally, us and Europe will kind of hunker down and China can take the rest of the world. Does that sound like a kind of a confident country? Remember, for much of the 20th century, the US fought tooth and nail to open up markets, to make trade free, because it had such an advantage with its companies. They were so much better, so much more efficient, so much more well capitalized and financed that they would wipe the floor if trade was free. So they fought for that. Now it seems the boot's on the other foot with China. The other reason that I can't give a firm answer to this is maybe China's just wrong. Maybe AI will, have some kind of incremental improvements on what we can do now. Maybe material science will improve, but won't make a kind of quantum leap where we can, have, carbon nanotube buildings made in a single day, right? Like maybe it won't make that kind of quantum leap. Maybe it's just that we'll be able to save like 3% on the cost of making a high-rise flat because of new innovations. But, these skyscrapers 3% less to produce, but that's hardly a kind of quantum leap. Maybe green energy will make, it'll make the air nicer to breathe. There won't be kind of coal soot everywhere, but it won't give us like abundant, super cheap energy that we can invent new ways to use, which in itself will kind of drive economic development. Maybe this is going to be incremental. Maybe this is not going to be a leap. Maybe the Chinese are just wrong on this. So I can't really tell. But what I can say is that the Chinese have a real plan that goes far beyond, or it seems anyway. I'm not an expert at China, but from what I'm reading from somebody who is something of an expert in China, they have a serious plan. Like, they have an idea to harness technological and scientific innovation, discovery, and development in a way that, ultimately as a side effect would supercharge their economic development and growth and standards of living. And as we said at the top of the show, the Americans are essentially saying, no, we're not going to allow that to happen if we can at all help it. If we can, we're going to stop you. And I think this is going to be the key. I mean, the great power rivalry that's now clearly in full swing between two peer competitors. The US has never in its history had a peer competitor, or, not since the late 19th century anyway. As it faces a peer competitor and engages in a great power rivalry, that great power rivalry is going to take place over a number of axes: diplomatic, military, economic, in terms of soft power and influence as well. And a lot of those will intersect, and these axes will intersect, and they will, they will affect each other. But on the economic axis specifically, we now start to see the lines being drawn, the armies brought into the economic armies being brought into formation, what the battle is going to look like. And I think because of that, a combination of the tariffs that the Biden administration has imposed, and in addition with previous actions with regard to the WTO and restrictions on Chinese access to high-tech goods, and what happened in March with the kind of the big reveal of Chinese ideas and plans for future economic development, I think that's going to be essentially how the battle lines are drawn. And that's the way people should see things, and people should understand it. It's a much bigger picture, and it's a much deeper story than people are being led to understand through the mainstream press and even the financial papers.
For more on the Chinese plan, be sure to subscribe to Multipolarity's new Substack, where Andrew will be putting down some extended thoughts. This week, we also have an introductory essay called What is Multipolarity? And from next week, every Thursday, we'll have the Multipolarity Briefing, a series of links and thoughts to keep you up to date on the latest multipolar developments. Simply search for Multipolarity on substack.com.